The Asare family carried a name that echoed with pride and power in Accra. For generations, they had lived by one rule. No one could marry into their bloodline unless they were already a professor with a PhD. It was a tradition carved in stone, older than memory, stronger than love. But for Essie Anderson, that rule was more than a family custom. It was the wall that stood between her and Kwame Asare, the man who had held her heart since childhood, the man who also happened to be her brother Kofi's closest friend. Kofi, loud and loyal, had always been her protector. His laughter filled the Anderson home, his arm often around Kwame's shoulder, their bond unshakable. To Essie, that bond was a prison of its own. How could she confess her feelings for Kwame when her brother adored him like family? To risk her brother's trust felt as dangerous as breaking the Asare rule itself. And then there was Amma, her mother, kind-eyed, soft-spoken, but never blind. Amma saw the way Acey's gaze lingered too long, the way her silence carried unspoken ache. In the quiet of their kitchen, she warned her daughter gently, "Love is powerful, but it can also be the heaviest chain." She urged Acey to fight for her dreams, to walk her own path, to be careful not to surrender her freedom to tradition disguised as love. Easy's world tightened between them. The brother whose friendship with Kwame kept her silent, and the mother whose wisdom urged her to choose carefully. And all the while, Kwame's eyes seemed to say the words he could never speak. This is the story of love that bloomed in silence, of tradition that demanded obedience, and of the family voices that shaped a young woman's choice between her heart and her destiny. The Asare name was spoken with reverence in Accra. For generations, their family had built a legacy of scholars, each marriage cemented not by love, but by the title of professor. No one entered their bloodline without a PhD, an iron rule passed down like scripture. Esai Anderson knew this well. It was the law that stood between her and Kwame Asare, the man she had loved silently since girlhood, the man who was also her brother Kofi's best friend. Her brother's laughter filled the Anderson home that evening, booming and unrestrained. The house was crowded for his birthday, neighbors and friends spilling across the sitting room. The smell of jollof rice and kelawele hung in the air. And at the heart of it all was Kofi. Tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, his arms slung around Kwame as though he belonged to their family already. "You'll see," Kofi announced to the room, grinning with pride. "This man will soon be a great professor, and I'll still be the one dragging him to parties." The guests laughed, and Kwame smiled modestly, though his eyes flickered with a quiet weight. Essie, seated near her mother, forced a smile that never reached her eyes. Her brother's words, meant in jest, only deepened the ache within her. Every time Kofi praised Kwame's brilliance, he unknowingly drove another wedge between her heart and her voice. How could she confess her feelings when her brother held Kwame so close, when the risk of breaking that bond was unthinkable? Amma, her mother, noticed. She always noticed. She leaned close, her silk headscarf brushing against Acey's hair. "You're staring," she whispered gently. Acey flushed and shook her head. "I'm not." Amma's smile was small, knowing, but her eyes were tender. She said nothing more, yet the silence carried more weight than words. Later that night, when the plates were cleared and the laughter softened, Professor Asare rose from his chair. His presence demanded stillness. His back was straight, his spectacles glinting beneath the light. His voice cut across the room like a blade. "I am proud of my son. Soon he will defend his thesis. Soon he will take his place as a scholar and continue the Asare legacy. We do not waver. We do not bend to modern foolishness. This is who we are." Applause filled the room, but Essie's stomach twisted. She glanced at Kwame. His smile was polite, practiced, but his eyes held a shadow. When the house grew quiet and guests began to leave, Essie slipped outside. The night air was humid, thick with the faint scent of roasted maize from a distant vendor. She drew in a breath, pressing her palms together to steady her heart. Behind her, footsteps approached. Escaping the noise? Kwame's voice was soft, familiar. She turned. He stood beneath the street lamp, its flickering light carving shadows across his face. "It was too warm inside," she murmured. "Or maybe you needed space from my father's speeches," he said with a half smile. Her lips parted. She hesitated, her pulse racing. Kwame, do you ever feel like tradition is a prison? His smile faded. He studied her carefully, his silence stretched taut. You mean the rule? She nodded, her throat tight. What if someone's heart doesn't care about PhDs or titles? What if it only cares about the person? The quiet was heavy, broken only by the rustle of trees. At last, he exhaled. You don't know how often I've thought about that. But my father, he would never forgive me if I broke the line. To him, tradition is life itself. Then why not defy it? She whispered. His answer came heavy. Because to my family, tradition isn't just pride, it's survival. And then, almost reluctantly, he told her the story, the origin of the Asare vow. Long ago, Kwame's grandfather Kojo was nothing more than a farmer's son in a dusty village. He walked barefoot for miles to school, books clutched to his chest, mocked as a village boy. By lantern light, he studied until his eyes bled with exhaustion. He won a scholarship abroad, returned with a PhD, and became one of the first Asares to be called professor. But triumph bred bitterness. Kojo's wife, a wealthy merchant's daughter, despised his obsession with study. Their marriage rotted with scorn until one night, as Kojo lay coughing blood from months of overwork, she took their only son by the hand and threatened to leave. In that moment, half dead on the floor with his books scattered around him, Kojo made his vow. Never again would ignorance or disdain weaken the Asare line. Love without learning was betrayal. He survived, but he hardened. His son, the man who would become Professor Asare, grew up under that vow, taught that education was not just honor, but the family's very lifeline. To marry outside of academia was to risk exile, shame, and collapse. Fear became law. Law became tradition. By the time Kwame was born, the rule was scripture. Only professors, only PhDs, or you are no Asare. Essie shivered at the tale. It was more than she had imagined, less pride than curse. A tradition born in blood and fear. She met Kwame's eyes, saw the torment there, and whispered, "But what about love?" His eyes softened, his voice dropping to a whisper. If it could survive without tradition, it would be you. Her heart clenched. The words she had longed for were finally spoken, but they came dressed in sorrow, not promise. Inside, Kofi's laughter rang faintly from the house. Essie turned back, her chest aching. Between her brother's loyalty and her mother's warnings, the truth pressed heavier than ever. She could not simply follow her heart. Days bled into weeks. Essie busied herself with studies and volunteer work, her fire for activism burning brighter with every rally and gathering. One afternoon, she stood before a small crowd at the university gates, her voice fierce as she spoke of women's rights. Her words were sharp, her passion undeniable. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, Kwame, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. When the speech ended, he came to her. "You speak with fire," he said quietly. "It's what I believe in," she answered, brushing a curl from her face. "If we don't fight for those without a voice, what's the point of our education?" "My father would call it reckless," he murmured. "He thinks the world changes only in lecture halls." "Sometimes the streets speak louder than the halls," she replied, her eyes holding his. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words lost. His hand twitched as though it ached to reach for her, but he turned away. That night, Amma found Essie at the kitchen table, her notebook scattered, her face tired but restless. She poured her daughter a cup of tea and sat beside her. "You love him," Amma said gently. It was not a question. Essie's throat tightened. Amma shook her head. "I know. But listen, my child, love can be a blessing, yes, but it can also be the heaviest chain. I want you to follow your dreams. I want you free. But if you give your heart to a man bound in chains of tradition, those chains may bind you too." Essie stared into her tea, her chest tight. "So what am I supposed to do? Pretend I don't feel it?" Amma's hand covered hers. "No, but know that sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes courage means walking away." The words sank deep, heavy as stone. The distance between her and Kwame widened. His thesis consumed him, his father's expectations pressing harder with each day. One evening, as she prepared notes for a conference, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart knew before her eyes confirmed. It was him. Kwame stood in the doorway, his face drawn, eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said softly, "Walk with me." They moved through the quiet streets, the hum of the city fading behind them. The air was still, thick with the weight of what remained unsaid. At last, Essie stopped, turning to face him. "Why are you here, Kwame?" she asked, her voice low but unsteady. His eyes searched hers, desperate, almost pleading. "Because I can't keep pretending. My father wants me to defend, to take the title, to marry someone who fits his mold. But Essie..." His voice broke. "All I see is you." Her breath caught, but the ache inside her flared like fire. "And yet you'll choose them," she said bitterly. "You'll stand in those halls and prove to your father you are the perfect Asare son. Where does that leave me?" He stepped closer, his hands trembling as though fighting the urge to touch her. "It leaves you as the reason I question everything, the reason I can't sleep, the reason I wonder if tradition is worth the chains it binds me with." "Then break them," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "Choose me, Kwame, just once. Choose love over expectation." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. His chest rose and fell, his eyes burning with conflict. She could see the war waging inside him, the son of the Asares against the man who loved her. Finally, he closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "If I do, I lose everything. My family, my name, the only life I've ever known. And if you don't," she said, her voice trembling, "you lose me." The words lingered in the night like a verdict. Neither moved, neither spoke. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance, and the world kept turning as their hearts stood still. At last, he opened his eyes, and in them was a sorrow she would never forget. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers, but he did not take it. "I will always love you, Essie," he whispered. "But love is not enough." Her breath shattered in her chest. She turned, unable to bear the sight of him, and walked away. Each step felt like a blade, but she did not stop. She could not. Behind her, Kwame stood alone beneath the street lamp, the golden light casting his shadow long against the pavement. He did not call after her. He did not follow. And in that silence, both knew the truth. Some chains are too heavy to break, and some loves too fierce to survive them. The day of his defense came, and with it, triumph. Dr. Kwame Asare. Applause thundered through the hall as his father beamed with pride. Kwame bowed his head, but his eyes searched the crowd. She was not there. Essie was at the airport, passport in hand. A fellowship had arrived, an opportunity to fight for human rights abroad. Her dreams, the ones her mother had nurtured, were finally within reach. Yet her heart trembled as she stepped toward the gate, waiting for a voice that never came. She boarded the plane alone. Years passed. Essie's name appeared in newspapers, her speeches broadcast across continents. She was the face of change, her voice carrying hope to the voiceless. Yet in quiet hotel rooms, she sometimes closed her eyes and remembered the boy under the street lamp, whispering that she was everything. Kwame became a professor, his lectures filling halls, his books praised by scholars. To the world, he was the perfect heir of the Asare legacy. But at night, when his office was silent, he often stared at the empty chair across from him and imagined it filled with her laughter. And then, one evening, fate bent the rules. It was at a global education summit in Accra. The hall buzzed with dignitaries and activists, professors and politicians. Essie stood at the podium, her presence commanding, her words cutting with fire and grace. Kwame, seated among the panelists, felt the years collapse in an instant. When the session ended, their eyes found each other across the crowd. Neither spoke at first, the silence full of everything they had lost and everything they had become. Slowly, Kwame crossed the room. Essie's heart thudded as he stopped before her, older now, but with the same depth in his gaze. "You kept your promise," he said softly. "You changed the world." "And you kept your family's legacy," she replied. Her smile wavered, half proud, half sad. For a moment, the weight of the years pressed between them, but then Kwame's hand, no longer trembling, reached for hers. This time, he didn't pull back. "Maybe now," he said, voice low but steady, "we can write our own rule." Essie's eyes glistened. For the first time, she didn't feel torn between love and freedom. She had both. And in that crowded hall, beneath banners celebrating knowledge and progress, Essie and Kwame stood side by side, not bound by tradition, nor broken by it, but carrying it forward in a way that left room for love.